And I will leave you in the ever-capable hands of Professor Nick Reed.
Thank you very much, Dan. And just before we kick off, in the programme for today, it does mention that this is a smart motorway session, but it is, in fact, as titled, Data for the Smart System, for the Safe System. If we want to get into smart motorway questions, we can also do that as well if we want to. But anyway, welcome to this panel session on Data for the Safe System. Thanks very much to RSGB and to Agilysys for inviting me to host this session, and indeed to the esteemed panelists that we have joining us today. The discussion topic is that it's data for the safe system, and of course it's huge. We all know that in this room. We're thinking about what data can tell us with regard to safe roads, safe vehicles, safe road users, safe speeds, and safe post-crash care. And all of that wrapped in a safe road management system. We're thinking about what data can do to help us predict where incidents might occur, helping us to understand what has happened when an incident has occurred, and then, of course, looking at evaluations. If we've introduced safety measures, how have they had an impact on the level of risk, on the number of incidents that we observe? My name is Nick Reed. I work in road safety through my company, Reed Mobility, and also as National Highways Chief Road Safety Advisor. My role with National Highways is very much about what its priorities should be in relation to those pillars of the safe system. So I'm absolutely fascinated in what the discussions today might reveal. And yep, as I said, 5 great panelists from a range of different backgrounds to help us navigate this challenging territory. So maybe Aaron, start with you. You'd like to introduce yourself, your company, and what you do.
Sure. So thanks for having me. Aaron Jarvis. I work for a business called Geotab. Should probably pick up the microphone. And so Geotab fundamentally is a connected vehicle business. So our aim is to connect the vehicles of businesses to help them essentially use vehicle data to optimize what they're doing. So, in this context, that looks like reducing their risk, but also we help vehicle fleets reduce their carbon emissions. We help them be more compliant and generally just trying to connect the vehicles that they're operating so that they can manage those assets and the drivers of those assets efficiently to run a better business, essentially.
Thank you, Aaron. Will.
Yes, my name is Will Cumming. I'm the Research Director for Road Safety GB. My day job is the Safer Essex Roads Partnership Manager. My background is in data analysis, so I was the Partnership Data Analyst for 6 years. Our partnership focuses on the 4 traditional E's of road safety, of enforcement, education, and I've forgotten the third one.
Engineering, yeah.
And then the fourth one of engineering is carried out by our other teams within our partnership, and we're in the process of trying to bring that together to build a safe system.
Hi, I'm Tanya Fosdick, Research Director of Agilysys, who I hope you should know because many of the people in the team are in the room today. So I have a background in research and data analysis. I started off at a safety camera partnership many moons ago, but my main interest now is behaviour change and also helping write safe system strategies.
Hello, I'm John Cartledge. I'm the Global Development Manager at Gase Solutions. We primarily take imagery, very detailed imagery, to produce highway and pavement condition models, asset registers to build the models of the highway for scheme design and get funding to make the roads better. I'm not going to say the word pothole. What we've also now started taking is lots of connected vehicle data since 2018 as extra insights, and that's providing lots of information about areas of harsh braking, degradation models, and allowing us to do multimodal risk models for the highways. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Neil Kinnear. I am lead behavioural scientist at a company called Human. That looks like Human, but it's not. It's called Human. Human is an insurtech that uses geospatial and behavioural data to price insurance in real time, so pricing by the journey, by the second. And basically I'm there to look at how to use the insights derived from the data we collect to use that in a way to manage risk for the fleets and drivers that are insured.
Brilliant. Just keep the mic for a second, Neil. Later on in the session, I'll invite you to ask your own questions, so do be thinking about what you'd like to ask the panellists. If there's anything you want to ask urgently, do raise your hand, and I know the online audience have the opportunity to raise questions as well. But yeah, if we start with you, Neil, what makes a good driver, and how do we use data to determine that?
It's a very good question, Nick.
Thank you.
So I guess traditionally we've looked at a good driver as being one that demonstrates good manual handling skills. Over time we've started to realise that that's actually nonsense. And in truth, what really demonstrates a good driver is one that has good higher order skills, and by that I'm using psychology terminology to mean things such as hazard perception, anticipation, good attention, good regulation of their emotions when driving, that sort of thing. So we've conducted our academic studies. We've been able to see, using physiological data and brain imaging studies, that we can differentiate between novice and experienced drivers based on their perception of risk on the road. So we know that anticipation of what could happen is really key to whether a driver becomes a safe driver or not, or the benefit of experience that's given. But what we need to do is move out of the laboratory and onto the real road, because we can't fit necessarily sort of skin conductance sensors in cars. I mean, we can, and some have tried, but it's very, very challenging. Clearly, we certainly can't put sort of brain scanning equipment in vehicles yet. So, although we have occupant monitoring systems, which will take us into a new era, we need to find ways just now of using the data we've got to understand what relates to risk in terms of the driving style that you see from people you measure. And at the moment, it's companies like ourselves and others on the panel here that are looking to use the data we're collecting to really understand what that driving style looks like and how it relates to actual risk on the road.
And maybe passing to John, do you want to pick up on that? What data you think you're collecting around what good driving looks like?
So for us, the interesting piece isn't about the driver, it's about how the vehicle is behaving on the highway. And since 2018 and the advent of eCall, the little emergency call button, every vehicle, new vehicle by law, has had to be connected. So it's transmitting data about what the vehicle's doing and how the vehicle is experiencing the highway. That can be in terms of when the vehicle's braking harshly, when it's braking harshly, when it's losing friction. It could be the average speed, the volumes of data. There's all sorts of insights that come from vehicles, and the average vehicle now has about 2,000 sensors. So we know all the contextual information as well, so the time of day, the weather conditions, when all these incidents are happening. There's about 15 million harsh braking events on the UK roads recorded every month. Just far too much data. So by filtering it and boiling it down to specific road sections, we combine it with infrastructure information and historic data to validate it, to then get insights about the vehicle rather than the driver. The data's all anonymised as well, but it does correlate, and unlike spot testing, it's a constant stream of data. And that's really important, because what that allows you to do is look at post-intervention activity. If you look before you've made an intervention, and then after, you can see the impact the intervention has made by the way the vehicles are operating. By vehicles, it could be cyclists with C-Sense, it could be connected BMW motorbikes, e-scooters, it could be cars, HGVs.
And moving on to you, Tanya, thinking about those interventions and using the data for evaluation, and the diminishing returns from engineering approaches, the sort of behavioural elements become ever more important, I think. So yeah, what are you seeing in terms of behavioural change and versus the engineering approach?
Well, I suppose the first thing is engineering is a form of behaviour change, is used for behaviour change. And so we have to think about, as Nicola was talking about right at the end of her presentation, really understanding the behavioural problem we want to address. So delving into the data, be it quantitative or qualitative, other research available, to, well, what are we seeking to understand here? What is the problem? And only then can we start to think about whether or not we're looking at an engineering solution, be it in vehicle or on the roads, or something else, within other spheres like enforcement. And I suppose the other thing to think about here is kind of at the end of that process, whilst we're thinking about interventions, is what evidence we have about effectiveness. Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at education, we know that the evidence is weak. Now, there's probably very good reasons then to do more evaluations and try and understand what might work. But I think there are kind of strong arguments for education being used alongside some of these other behaviour change interventions in order to help explain and increase their effectiveness.
And that evaluation piece for you, Will, this must be incredibly important, representing the interests of the residents, the communities of Essex, demonstrating good value for money and that you're providing a safe environment for driving. How do you go about showing that?
So, yes, that's essential really, is the evaluation piece, and particularly with ambitious aims like Vision Zero, yes. And the need to implement a safe system. There are many different aspects to a safe system. There are the 5 layers of protection or pillars, or however it's expressed in different areas, and each of those can contain a number of interventions. The task is huge. The amount of investment required is huge. So there is a need to prioritise budgets, and there is a need to invest in what works, whether it's an engineering intervention, whether it's a behavioural change aimed directly at road users. And it's something that is still probably relatively undeveloped. We do, as kind of road safety broadly, we do look at the impact, and we gather data on our interventions, but we need to learn more really about what works and whether what is being done is absolutely the best option. And data is really where that comes from. The presentations we've seen this morning have all been really great examples of how data does inform the evaluation of whether or not an intervention is working.
You mentioned your 2040 target, Vision Zero. What's your biggest hurdle to achieving that, do you think, and how is data helping you to understand where the challenge lies?
Biggest hurdle, it's probably the funding thing, because there is a huge engineering challenge in creating the safe roads and roadsides aspect of the safe system. So the way that that data can assist with that is to demonstrate things like value for money. These aren't brand new cutting edge concepts. Engineers, I can see Ross and Lawrence sitting in the front there. They've been demonstrating value for money for casualty reduction schemes for years, and it's taking that onto the much broader, grander scale of the whole safe system, not just looking at one site that has got a casualty problem. It's looking at the whole network to say not every single collision and injury is happening within an identifiable hotspot or casualty reduction site. It's across the network. So we need to address the risk across the network to gather all those seemingly random collisions and address those before they happen. Yeah. And where data comes in is, traditionally we've looked at Stats 19 because that proves there was a problem. We look at the other data sets that other people are presenting here that can then help us prioritise the risk mitigation approaches rather than just the more reactive casualty site mitigation schemes.
Thank you. Well, moving to you, Aaron, the sorts of system you introduce, what kind of scale of impact does that have? What is the safety benefit that can be achieved through the use of data?
Really good question. So significant, I would say, in a word. So we have some of our larger customers that have seen, upwards of 25% reduction in their loss ratio on the road, and virtually any vehicle that is starting to be managed using its data in the business context sees an improvement. So, the most shocking thing for me joining Geotab was how quickly we were able to identify risk within a fleet and start to reduce it, even in the fleets where, perhaps they were looking to prove that we couldn't. So, here's our 5 best drivers, we'll run a pilot with those guys, and that, we definitely won't see a reduction there. And all of a sudden, there is a huge reduction because we're able to identify some small things that actually even the best driver does that we can start to reduce, whether that's reaction times that could be improved, whether that's, maybe a minor violation of driving hours. Oh, well, it's only 15 minutes longer than I should have been driving, but it was important to the business that I got to that point that start to bring that risk down dramatically.
And what's the shape of that improvement? How does it sort of asymptote over time, or does it start to increase again over time?
Yeah, it's one of the big challenges. So, as with anything, if you say, hey, Aaron, I'm going to start looking at what you're doing when you're driving your vehicle, I'll drive better for a week. And the big challenge is maintaining that over time. So that's where you start to get into the compliance and the kind of management by exception within a business. And I think that's relatively easy in business terms. I work for my employer. If they tell me I need to do certain things and that's part of getting paid my salary, I will. What's interesting is looking at that when you start to come into the kind of the consumer space. So we did some interesting studies on people returning to the road kind of at the end of COVID, let's say, and the driving behaviour was much more risky simply because, one, there were less drivers on the road, so maybe I'll drive a bit faster or, whatever the reason for that is, but also being out of practice. So kind of late braking and poor performance, to the point of hazard perception. If you're less used to seeing those hazards and less used to being directed to drive safely, that has a significant impact.
And if you can send the mic down to Neil. Just wondering, by contrast, how much does your work think about individual drivers, or are you looking at fleets? What's the sort of granularity of how human works?
Yeah, so the granularity is tight because you're looking at by second. So the risk is being priced per second.
Right.
But what we're not interested in is an individual event. So a driver demonstrating a harsh braking event at a single point in time doesn't really tell you that much. What we're interested in is the trend of that driver that starts to develop the driving style and the exposure that they have to the sort of environmental context in which they're operating. So that's the key thing. It's about understanding the development of those trends for the driver, that you can provide insights, that they can do something about it, but also for the fleet as a whole, because often there will be systematic elements to the driver's behaviour in itself. So the fleet may have a policy that actually motivates delivery within a time frame. Well, actually what you're driving there is sort of a motivation to get there as quick as possible rather than to get there as safe as possible. And so it could be that actually the fleet is developing that. And we had an example of a fleet that installed speed limiters because they were getting lots of speeding tickets and things. And they thought that would have reduced their risk. And then they came on to insurance with us and we installed the boxes and we found that actually their speeding on urban and rural roads was really bad. And they were at really high risk because the drivers were limited on motorways and dual carriageways, and they were making up the time in these higher risk roads. So actually all they'd done is shift the risk and actually probably elevated the risk, although we don't know that for sure, but that's the likely thing. So it's about using that. But ultimately, I think the important thing is that insurance plays a very important part here because it has a lever that no one else does. It's got a financial aspect to it, and particularly in a commercial environment. And that means that you can price it fairer, you can empower fleets and drivers to be able to do something about it where they haven't had that insight before. And then thirdly, it brings it into line with the safe system. So insurance used to just be a financial product that simply offered protection in the event of loss. And what InsurTech brings in is the safe system aspect of leading indicators of prevention and loss. And so it really, I think, for me, it's just clearly the future of how the insurance industry becomes part of a safe system. And that's really, really key and important.
And Tanya, from the kind of application of safe system approaches, it's becoming more widespread, not least in Essex, but also national highways. What data do we need? What analysis do we need to help embed that into the kind of business as usual for roads authorities?
Sure. So obviously we have the work that colleagues here are doing in terms of collecting specific data that will inform safety performance indicators. I know that, well, you're doing a big road user survey at the moment to understand specifically self-reported behaviour, which are kind of then aligns with what's gathered from vehicles. But I think also if we're going to embed safe system, we need to ensure that it isn't just kind of words on a page or on a strategy, and that actually it's embedded into everything that we're doing and all of the stakeholders are involved, which is obviously all of us, including the road users. So there are actually quite a few pieces of work being carried out now looking at how to measure safe system readiness. So the FIA have created a road safety index, which is being used by businesses to understand how their safety value is progressing and how the supply chains are kind of implementing safe system thinking. Similarly, we have the ITF Safe System Framework, which allows people to, countries or organisations, or even down to the project level, understand what safe system actions they might be taking and how to move forward and kind of progress further into safe system thinking. Ourselves, we've done some work on safe system culture, working with national highways, and again, that very much embedding it, so it's what organisations do. It's what they believe, it's the norms, it's the language, it's the roles. Coming back to Will saying, the funding, actually, if everybody from top to bottom across an organisation or a partnership really understands safe system thinking, and then hopefully it's not just reliant on one person or one strategy. But that means we need to collect data on all of those elements of it. What are the languages? What is the language? What are the norms? What are the policies are in place which support safe system thinking?
And what would a good safe system ready organisation look like, to your mind?
So as part of that, we've quantified it. We reviewed, I think it's close to 20 international safe system guidance, and we took all of the actions that that came up frequently in those documents. So it's about a commitment to those actions, but it is also, as I said, about having roles, the language of safe system really embedded throughout, so that people, whether or not they're an engineer on the ground or a traffic officer, really understanding how their responsibility lies within the system.
John, you were kind enough to show me some of your presentation at the stand out there, and encourage others to go and see it. Reflecting on what Tanya said and thinking about what you were talking earlier, I don't think it's just safe vehicle pillar that your work applies to. I think it's much broader than that. Do you want to kind of explain where you see GACE fitting into the safe system approach?
Sure. I think for us there's multiple levels of engagement with multiple markets. The road and pavement network aren't just communication transport infrastructure. They're communication infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure, the economic highway between ports, harbours, train stations, everything. They're vitally important, and the condition of them allows a better economy, allows better healthcare, education, all those things. So when we looked at data from vehicles augmenting other data that exists, so all the historic data, the infrastructure built data, multimodal risk was really interesting. So one of the things we did was work with the Smart Mobility Living Lab in London, and got every CCTV feed to understand the exact volume, speed of all the multimodal types, pedestrians, cyclists, scooters, everything. And that identified crossovers in paths and speeds, which were validated by connected vehicle data. So we could then create multimodal risk maps for every road automatically. So what? Great. So we were thinking, what's the benefit? Where does the value come from in changing behaviour? So we're working with fleet management companies to broadcast those risk locations to fleet drivers so they change their behaviour when they're driving. Because if they know there's a higher risk of road conditions, cyclist, pedestrian activity, they actively slow down a little bit. Same with autonomous vehicles which are coming. Completely different system. You can broadcast the same risk locations to autonomous vehicles and they can change their behaviour slightly to be more defensive. You can do exactly the same with normal drivers. So using existing networks like IVIM, denim technology, you can broadcast messages to mobile phone navigation apps seamlessly in the background, to in-car infotainment systems about these risks. And it's around that cognitive piece of understanding I'm entering a higher risk area, I will change my behaviour slightly. But you can validate it from the information. So it's multiple systems that the data and the insights have to work with. It's not just one system. And it's that measurement and that proof it's making a difference as well.
Yeah. And a concern I have is around, with all of that data, how does it scale? So I was going to ask you, Aaron, as you go to more and more vehicles, more and more data points around what the vehicle's doing, where does it end?
Good question. I think we could probably start on where it needs to start. So I think it was interesting today watching some of the presentations because virtually all of them spoke about a data gap. And for any business or any community that's trying to look at a set of data, in Europe we have the hurdle to overcome, which is GDPR, and operating within that level of privacy where there's a general apprehension to have your data captured. So starting from the point of an insurer that's saying, right, to opt in to be insured by me, you need to share your GPS with me so I can look at things like speed. Well, there's a financial incentive to opt in and the driver can clearly see the outcome there. But as we start to kind of get a bit more macro, if we're saying, hey, we need to know where you are for an intangible reason today. So later we want to look at potholes, to use that example. So we need the accelerometer data so that we can help the City of London make the roads better. Or maybe we need to look at fault codes so that we can help your leasing company or your fleet management company or your OEM design a better vehicle. Those things are quite difficult to do today in terms of just speaking to a driver and saying, hey, can we collect 2,000 data points from you? So what's really important is designing the system for privacy and for scale so that we start from a point where we have the option to collect lots of data but don't if the driver or the fleet or the community don't want you to. But once you've justified that you should, being able to turn that on easily, and that becomes then scale. So once you get into a situation like we're in now, so you spoke about lots of data points per day, Geotab are collecting something like 50 billion data points a day, and to do that, you need to be able to operate at quite a large scale. And we're just a business, we're not a country, we're not the City of London trying to collect all of that data. So it's really important to design for that scale. Right. So we're both private and scalable, and the two are quite interlinked. And I think if, as an industry, we start to get into that headspace, I think some of these presentations will be a bit easier because now when there's a reason to get some data about ethnicity or about crashes in a certain area and get a bit more granular, the data will actually be more available because it's there with legitimate interest to get it.
Yeah. And Will, just from your perspective, do you feel you have the skills, the technical capability to manage this challenging data environment? And also, a kind of follow-up question, is there a concern about like vendor lock-in, that you work with one supplier and then end up being attached to that supplier because of processes that are then associated with the data they provide which aren't compatible with those sorts of issues?
Okay, yes, so to pick up on the first point around the skills, one of the difficulties we face really in partnerships and local authorities is there are lots of us, we haven't got a national target that all gets us pulling in the same direction. So we've got different leaderships with different priorities. So some partnerships are very proactive in trying to establish a safe system. Others, not so much. They've got their leadership are pulling them in different directions with different priorities. So we've got a kind of a lack of national collaboration. There is forums like this are fantastic for gaining national collaboration, but it's between a couple of dozen maybe authorities rather than all of them, and the consequence of that is a kind of a siloing of skills, of resources, and of ideas. So what we really need to do is increase that national collaboration to put in the same direction, and that siloing does mean that one authority, one organisation may have somebody who is particularly great at behavioural change. Another person might have someone who's really good on the data science side of things, and just chatting to people last night and today, there's huge amounts of skills outside of local authority partnerships that we do need to tap into, because we don't have everything, and there are ever more data sets out there, and it does require ever more specialist skills and knowledge to get the benefits out of those data sets. So that kind of feeds into your second question really around vendor lock-in. It's not something I've directly experienced in conversations, in meetings about how do we best invest in data. It's even more at the stage of the very kind of risk-averse nature of local authorities not wanting to spend any money unless they absolutely have to. If getting stuff for free is, but that there is perhaps a lack of recognition that in itself carries a risk. There is the risk of inaction. We do need to avoid action for action's sake, which can be doing harm. And the first rule, which I've always reminded by Tanya, I always think of Tanya whenever I think of this, which is rule 1 is do no harm. So sometimes inaction might be the right thing if you don't know exactly what you need to be doing. But we do, as authorities, need to get away from the fear that it might not be as great as we think it is. It might, but I think the worst case scenario is you learn something, and it's never bad to learn something. So I think that's really where we need to go. Try things out. Don't sign up to a 20-year contract that you can't get out of. But I don't think anyone's really offering those sorts of terms. So I think try stuff, evaluate it. Absolutely essential. Evaluate it. If it doesn't work, learn, move on. If it does work, great. Either way, you've moved, you've progressed towards a better road safety service.
Yeah. I will pause at that point, offer the opportunity for any questions or anything from our online attendees. Ivo.
Got a question from the floor. Hi, very interesting. Well, I am probably not the only one here who never reads terms and conditions, and I just press the button. And I suspect in all likelihood you have an enormous population who have done uninformed consent. Given that, and given that if you look at what data can do, you can very quickly get to things that are a bit creepy, how does the road safety sector, particularly the sort of local government and police side of it, avoid a sort of political, like a sort of Cambridge Analytica moment, where people suddenly realise, hold on a minute, I didn't sign up for this. I'm explaining to a colleague that live traffic data in my car is great, but it's a bit like a sausage, and you don't really want to know what's in it and how it's made. So how do you grapple with that? Because presumably at some point it comes, that moment.
So I think there's two parts to that. One is where the data's coming from, which is really important. We only work with tier one sensor manufacturers and the OEMs themselves. There's a very good reason for that, because it's consistent across all the OEM brands, and it's fully GDPR compliant, and I'll go into that as to why. There is other information which is mass sourced from mobile phones, smartphones, and it's less reliable, but it's also not protected in the same way as OEM data. The OEM data is completely vehicle agnostic, so it cannot be tracked back to any vehicle, any owner, and it can't also be tracked back to any particular journey, because the start of the journey and the end of the journey are always truncated. So what you end up with is completely anonymous data where you don't know the vehicle, the owner of the vehicle, the journey, and in some instances, time of day even. Depends how generalized they make the data. That's good, because what they can add in is other contextual information about the weather conditions, a broad time of day stamp. So you're getting to understand the data in terms of, was it raining, was it sunny, was it low sun? And that gives far more insight. Mobile phone data, personally, Gase don't trust for a couple of reasons. I bet every single one of you mount your mobile phone in your car in a different way. Some have it in the glove box, some have it on the seat, some have it on a vent mount, screen mount. So all the sensors are recording different things. And if your car, if you've got your phone on your seat, you brake harshly, it's going to hit the floor well. And that would report you'd had an accident when you haven't. Really good example of that was the emergency messages that were going out from a very big brand of phone, where they thought somebody had had an accident but didn't realise it was 50 people on a roller coaster. So you've got to be really careful where you get your data from and understand how it's collected and how it can be applied. And that is 100% GDPR compliant data that cannot be tracked back. Even if you look at the raw data, which we don't do, we get insights from that data combined with other data, because not everybody is a data scientist. I know I'm not. Not everybody's got a team of data scientists, the cloud computing, the infrastructure to do it. So getting derived insights from trusted data that is GDPR compliant is key. So you won't end up with the Cambridge Analytics scraped from phones, Facebook, Instagram.
Sorry, maybe my question's more about the politics of it, because if I just went out and bought a nice, fancy new Mercedes that was very powerful and probably designed largely to go and break the law in, I would be quite annoyed to discover that Mercedes has turned my data into money and sold it, and at some point it's come back down to you. It's more of a political question of how do you grapple perhaps with an unfair response where people say, well, we don't care that it's GDPR compliant because we've never read any of the details. We never knew any of this was happening. I didn't see that CCTV camera. This is all a bit nefarious and underhand. It's just maybe a question about the inevitable, possibly political interaction, the media response. It's not meant to be a technocratic question.
Yeah, I think the ubiquitous of data now is there and used for many things, and most of that is for our benefit. If you declined sharing your data on your phone, for example, on your smartphone, it's not a smartphone because the app doesn't work. It's just a phone. You go back to being able to make phone calls and nothing more. The motor industry has moved from, when I bought my first car, I paid for it, I owned it. Nowadays, there's a shift towards not owning a car, but leasing a car. And part of leasing the car is around the services that are in car. BMW just got lambasted for not turning on all the functionality in the vehicle unless you pay a monthly fee. For example, if you sign over more of your data from the vehicle, and this is really important, it's not the person, it's the vehicle, you get more services activated and you don't have to pay for them. So it's part of exactly the same as what smartphones have done for everybody, but sharing the vehicle data, because most vehicles are now leased, in exchange for better services in the vehicle. I'm not defending the motor industry, but it enables us to get more information.
And Aaron, you must encounter customers or drivers, individual drivers, who are more reluctant to adopt a sort of what they might see as tracking of their driving behaviour.
Yeah, certainly. And I suppose just one thing I'd kind of add, I think, in response to you there is, I don't think we can avoid the day where someone realises that they've sacrificed a lot of their data to get things for free. I think what local authorities can do is what big businesses are starting to do now, and that's procure more responsibly. So you made the point before around not wanting to spend money and get things for free. When we work with local authorities, generally the decision's made on price, whereas larger businesses now are starting to make their decisions on other factors, whether that's carbon reduction or sustainability. I think if local authorities start to weight their decisions more heavily towards the ethics around the procurement of data and the ability to opt out and those types of things, we will see a change in the right direction. But that ultimately comes back to budgets. It's very difficult for a local authority to say we're not going to make all our decisions based on price if they don't have more money to spend on the things that they're doing. So my advice to local authorities would certainly be to weight more heavily towards good data practices, making sure that the data comes from a clear point and that it's GDPR compliant and all those good things. And then to your point around what does that look like in our world, so yes, certainly we generally start from a point where our union says we can't do that because drivers don't want to be tracked. And it's about moving away from the notion of tracking and the notion of providing something to the business for free towards providing something that's valuable to the driver. So if we look at Geotab's general approach to data is we don't base many things on GPS. We base most things on real engine data. So I don't need to know where you are to know that you're braking harshly. So now I'm not spying on you and saying, I know where you were at the weekend. But if I see you braking harshly continuously, or I see you exceeding your driver hours because your engine's running and your RPM's above X for a certain amount of time, well, actually, I can help make sure you get back to your family because we're flagging that maybe the business is working you too hard and that actually you're driving for 9 hours instead of 8 and those types of things. So it's about showing that value, and to one of the presentations earlier, in the emotion. So we'll make sure you get home to your family, and we're not going to be able to tell anyone where you are because we're not collecting that data, is how we generally address it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've got a question that's come in from some of our participants online saying, given the need to target limited resources, what are the panel's thoughts on how to go about prioritising interventions in a way that takes all aspects of the safe system into account? There are difficulties with engineering funding that's ring-fenced or long-standing highway authority responsibilities under the Road Traffic Act. And then there's a sort of subsidiary question, but the same issue around kind of other areas of delivery, so those things which lie outside the safe system, such as demands for carbon reduction, and how do we keep the focus on the safe system when there's so many other things competing?
So it's kind of prioritisation within the safe system, but then also in the context of other priorities.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point around other priorities. And and it ties in with the things around inequalities that were shown earlier, particularly the indicator that high uptake of a high proportion of female cycling is an indicator of a safe cycling network, and these things tie in. And I've noticed over the years with road safety taking more of an overlap with sustainable and active travel. So there are mutual priorities there. There are, a safe system benefits everyone. Safer network for active and sustainable travel gets motorised traffic off the road to those people who need to go by motorised traffic, have lower congestion, everyone gets cleaner air, there's less demand on health services, all of those benefits. So because those benefits cut across public sector priorities, that's one of the things where, again, the data that demonstrates those things to be true can be used to bring those budgets together and help prioritise those contributors to a safe system. So, for example, there's an ongoing project in Essex where we are looking at, and this also ties in with GDPR because there was some GDPR issues, looking at linking social care records with road collision records to identify people whose social care package from the local authority came about as a result of injuries sustained on the roads. So building that understanding of how a safe system can benefit not just the kind of road safety part of what we do, but everyone else, so that everyone is kind of pulling in that same direction and getting the benefits together, because it's that the Vision Zero, that ambitious 2040 target, it's not a target. Even my slip of the tongue said it was a target, so it's understandable that a lot of people believe it's a target. It's an ambition, but it's an ambition that won't be achieved by doing it alone. Everybody has a part to play in the system, so everybody has a contribution to make, and I think that's really the answer to helping prioritise all those different layers of protection and getting the investment and the time and effort put into those to achieve them.
And well, is data a key to understanding how that stakeholder group has to come together? This element needs to do that part, and this group needs to do that part. How does data play into that?
Data is key in understanding, first of all, the priorities, who's got what role to play, what are all the different variables that feed into the casualty problem. So those root cause analyses that have been carried out, like Nicola presented on, that's not what an analyst might sit there in my previous role traditionally call data that is in a structured database, but it's data that has been gone out and gathered for a specific task to design and evaluate an intervention.
I think go over to Neil. We've got a question for Neil to begin with, but then perhaps work along the line. If there were one type of data, source of data, to which you wish you had access, what would that be in the interests of road safety?
Can't believe you've come to me first. I have to think on the spot. There's too many to choose from. From a psychologist perspective, I would love to know a lot more about the driver in the vehicle and the mind state at any particular moment, and to be able to look at that alongside the way that they are driving in certain environments, and really understand the full package, because that's the bit we constantly never know. We measure data from the vehicle, we apply it to the driver, and we look at the context around the driver, but we know very little about that driver. And you will hear from fleet managers and things where you might have a driver who performs very well most of the time, and is a consistently high-scoring driver, but they might have a week where they're terrible, and they've had lots of risky events, and they inquire as to why, and they find out there's something has happened in their personal life, but they've brought that's affected the way they've driven for work in that week or period. So I think it would be something along those lines.
Yeah, and in the context of moving towards vehicles that will do some of the driving for us some of the time, that knowledge about driver state is going to become ever more important. But John, has that given you sufficient time to think of your nugget?
Mine are actually quite simple, because it's more around infrastructure information, and thinking with a multimodal hat on. We know, for example, there are mobile not spots where there are no coverage. Those are really high risk, and it's unfortunately going to get worse with 3G and 2G being turned off, that there will be more not spots. That's a risk on the highway. Things like knowing where there is CCTV camera coverage and where there isn't, because that's a propensity for more crime for certain modal types. And the third one is street lights, where there are street lights and where there aren't street light coverage for safe walking routes, for example, is another really important one. So for me, it's infrastructure data sets around mobile coverage, CCTV coverage, and street light coverage.
I was going to say, John, you're making it very hard for Aaron. You're nicking all the good ones, but Tanya.
I'm going to go Big Brother and ask for exposure data. I want to know by mode and sociodemographics how people are travelling, when they're travelling, so that we can really understand risk. It's really difficult right now for us to understand older driver risk, by time of day and, by mileage, or the pedestrian one. How much do people walk? When do they walk? Who walks where and when? So, I'd like to track everybody.
I had a kind of follow-up on that one, actually, because I wondered about the prevalence of the dash cam, the helmet cam systems, and their potential value in understanding the road safety challenge, and whether we're prepared to be able to manage that potential glut of data that might come from such systems.
That's not an area of expertise of me. Do you collect dash cam data? We do,
yeah. Okay. Perfect.
That's got me out of answering the more difficult question.
We'll come back.
So it was, as part of my research project, involves looking at camera data collected by cyclists reported to the police around close passes. And as part of that, I had to manually look through about 120 complaints of close pass to Essex Police and log and try and sort of categorise things to do with the road environment and the behaviours seen in a sort of a rough taxonomy of close pass. And that was very labour intensive. I got a small amount of insight out of it, which helped me confirm some findings in some other research that meant that the materials I was using was relevant to the further study. So, what I learned from that is there is a lot of contextual information contained within those videos, but it's very hard to extract manually. So to get something scalable, I expect you would be looking at some form of machine learning, image recognition type system, which is out of my expertise, but I think there are others who may know more about that and can comment on that as well.
So, Will, very professionally, you've answered both questions in a single answer. That's very impressive. Aaron, give us your one form of data you think you would help us in terms of road safety.
I think I will avoid your question a little bit, because I think what we're all saying here isn't that there's an extra data point that doesn't exist today that we need. It's about having the data available to interact with each other, essentially. So, the information about the infrastructure does exist, or it can be inferred, but is it available in the same place as some other information? So for me, it's about that kind of the ecosystem of data, and which links kind of nicely to the dash cam point, because what you're then able to do is kind of create a machine learning situation where different things can be combined together to give an insight rather than data. So, in that situation, it is possible today with existing machine learning models to say what is a close pass, as long as, you have that data, the footage available in that kind of within the ecosystem. So for me, it's about making sure that we have all of the information available where appropriate, so that these models can be applied and draw it together into insight rather than kind of segregated data points.
A chance for any more questions from the floor.
Thanks. Matt Staten from National Highways. Just a question about the fact that a lot of this discussion's focused on road user behaviour type data. And when we're talking about a safe system approach, the danger is here that we're driving person-based behavioural intervention. And that's not a safe system in a lot of cases. So how do we ensure that intervention crosses all 5 components of the safe system and intervene using this data?
Who would like to take that?
If there's no other volunteers, yeah, thanks, Matt. No, excellent point. And it's been slightly covered. I've just been saying 3 minutes. I'll try and speak quickly. It's been touched upon around the asset, the roads and roadside layer of protection. So using machine learning to gather more information about what is on the roadside and what engineering measures are in place and where that relates to risks. I think that's one really important development that is, there's a lot of work going into it, and it's progressing quite well, but there's a huge amount to gain from that. With probably the most under-focused one is the post-collision response, particularly the emergency response aspect of that. That's something we're quite unsighted on in Essex. As a road safety partnership, we want to learn more on. But the other aspect of post-collision response and care is actually learning from the collision. So gathering data post-collision, feeding that back into the cycle and filtering that into all 5 layers of protection, so that we can see all those underlying causes and all the dream data sets that everyone on the panel wants. A lot of those could be derived from improved post-collision response data gathering.
And Dan, I think there was one in the middle.
Yeah, Mike Dark from the Department for Transport. At the beginning of this very interesting panel discussion, you mentioned about collecting data on vehicles, not on the drivers, and you said it was completely anonymised. My question would be, how anonymised is it? Because I would have thought, if you're looking at vehicle performance, the age of the vehicle and maybe even the make or model of the vehicle would be relevant. You're able to collect data on that. You could do that without collecting anything about the drivers. Because let's say if you're looking at data on Ford Fiestas, there's millions of them out there. But is it completely anonymous, or does it go into that sort of detail which are going to show you how well different vehicles are performing on the road?
The answer is yes and no. You can get data specifically from one OEM brand directly, or you can get more ubiquitous coverage data which is averaged across most OEM brands, which is completely anonymised. Because we're only looking at the average speeds, the average traffic flows, the average of all drivers to identify areas where abnormal behaviour is occurring in the vehicle population in the UK. We don't work with single OEM brand, we work cross OEM brand. But you could get specific data from specific OEMs directly, not the data aggregators.
And with that, I think we are just about on time. So firstly, I would like you to thank the panellists in the traditional way. I think it's been a fantastic discussion and a really enjoyable tour of the safe system environment. So please. And we resume here at 2. I think the lunch is next door. To take the opportunity to attend the various stands that we have out there and in here. And we look forward to resuming at 2 o'clock. Thank you.